Alright everybody, welcome back. What's happening? To another week of learning from your couch. We're still talking about imperialism today. We're talking about it a little less from the you and me side of imperialism, of the regular people affected by a nation coming in and basically telling you what to do and what crops to harvest and how to make money and all of that. And we're looking at it from a little bit different perspective today. We're looking at it from the perspective of these three guys right here. Obviously, the late, great Teddy Roosevelt, of course, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. And if you remember, we've already talked about all three of these guys before. These are the same guys that we talked about, who we basically classified as progressive presidents. They're going to be the same three guys that we're going to talk about that are imperialist presidents as well. And the reason that we're talking about them today is because, I'm not sure if you know, but when you're president, basically you get to do whatever you want. Just kidding, that's not how it works. But you do get to decide how your country is going to interact with other countries. And the act of basically determining how you're going to be friends or enemies with other countries is something called diplomacy. So that's really what we're going to look at today. It's a term called diplomacy. So if you're following along with the guide, let's talk first about what diplomacy actually is. And diplomacy, if you are somebody who's never heard of it before, it's, from a textbook's perspective, it's called the act of managing international relations with other countries. To me, that sounds a little fancy pants. I like to call it, that second definition there, the art of dealing with people from other countries in an effective way. Basically, if you're president, you have to decide how you're going to interact with leaders of just about every place that you come into contact with. And you have basically a whole array of options in terms of how you get other countries to do what you want, or how you can maintain. I mean, think of it like a friendship or a relationship with anybody. I mean, you can treat somebody basically in any way that you want, and how you treat them and how you interact with them is going to really dictate the type of relationship that you have. So if you have somebody that you're trying to maintain a positive relationship with, you're probably going to treat them a little differently than if you have maybe an enemy that you're not super fond of, that you're going to treat in a different way. So this is basically going to be a three-way example of how these three presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, basically used their platforms as president to, I guess, enact is the best word, diplomacy on their behalf. So again, if you're following along, our big point today is, how did these three guys do it? How did they make diplomacy work for them? So just like everybody handles their own situations differently, presidents are going to have their own different methods of enacting diplomacy. Some presidents are going to use the military more than others. Some are going to use money, economic sanctions, and I put that big bubble there at the bottom left. If you're not familiar with what an economic sanction is, it's basically a financial penalty that you give a nation for not doing what you want, or doing something that you don't want them to do. The United States has used them a bajillion times. We're going to keep on using them. In more modern times, we've used them against places like Russia. We've used them in parts of the Middle East, in places where you might have terrorist action or groups doing things that you don't want, that really don't serve the interest of your country. At this time, with the world of imperialism, keep in mind, guys, that when I say we, I'm talking the United States, we have a goal, and that goal is to expand outward, right? That's what we've been talking about with imperialism. Our goal is to basically make our nation larger, expand our nation, go out and get more resources, make more money. And so a president can do that from several different standpoints. And just like we've talked about in the past with Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, they have their own style, they have their own way of doing things. All three of them are going to handle diplomacy a little bit differently. So again, you could use the military, you could use economic sanctions, you could use something like treaties or embargoes. We're basically going to get into the nitty-gritty, and I don't think this is going to take a crazy long amount of time for you to really grasp these three guys and what they're about. But let's just take a look at the three guys, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, and how they used diplomacy on their behalf. Why diplomacy matters when it comes to imperialism? Well, like we've talked about before, Imperialism is extending your country's rule over somebody else, over another nation or a territory. Basically, there's something over there that you want, so you're going to find a way to go get it and make it a part of the United States. Some things to keep in mind. Not everybody is going to respond super well to you when you are trying to colonize in their nation. Not everybody's going to respond well to that. You might have to get creative to make deals happen. If you've ever heard the old adage, I think it's that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar, or is it bees? I don't know. I don't catch bugs. But if you're nicer to people, they're going to be nicer back to you, right? And if you have people that you are extending your rule over, happy people are going to equal happy citizens. If you come in there and basically just lay the hammer down and say, this is how it's going to work, they might not respect you. They might not really keep you in very high regard. So even if you don't rule a territory, or maybe even if you do, it doesn't really help you if the people that you're ruling do not like you. So these three guys are going to do this in their own way. Let's see how they do it. Keep in mind here, the Monroe Doctrine, we've talked about it before. You can see a picture of James Monroe down there on the bottom left. That Monroe Doctrine, as of 1823, is basically a big keep out sign to Europe, right? For the whole Western Hemisphere. It's basically us saying, you have to stay out of the Western Hemisphere because the United States is going to be the protector of said Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, all three of these guys are going to actively enforce this because they're going to try and protect U.S. interest in the Western Hemisphere. Even though all of them are going to be different, they're all going to basically build on this foundational document that is the Monroe Doctrine coming out of the 19th century here. It's going to be a really, really important piece for them to build on. The first one, obviously, is going to be Teddy Roosevelt. And what do we know about Teddy Roosevelt, other than him being the coolest person ever to have lived in the history of forever? It's that he has this idea of speak softly, but carry a big stick, right? So you can imagine, we're going to call Teddy Roosevelt's style of diplomacy, and if you're following along on your note guide there, you'll notice that you have a little table for each of these three guys, and then for their style of diplomacy, and then for the example where it's used. For Teddy, we're going to call his style of diplomacy big stick diplomacy. Sometimes in a book or in some other documents, you might see it referred to as big gun diplomacy or gunboat diplomacy. It's all the same to me. I don't care how you remember it. Just know that Teddy uses his basically proverb of speaking softly and carrying a big stick. He's going to use the military to basically act as the police force in the Western Hemisphere. So if you can think about Roosevelt, he's the guy who, you know, he wants to be cordial, he wants to be civil and polite, but if you don't do what he asks, what's he going to do? He's going to pull out the big stick, right? And that stick for Roosevelt is going to be the Great White Fleet. That's his naval superiority. So when I think of Teddy Roosevelt and his style of diplomacy, and you can see on the right-hand side, I think of it this way. I think if somebody has like a big piece of paper that is the Monroe Doctrine that says keep out of the Western Hemisphere, Teddy Roosevelt basically attaches a little post-it note there to the bottom, and he calls that the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary, for all intents and purposes, for us anyway, what I want you to remember about the Roosevelt Corollary is that it's a little piece of paper that he attaches to the Monroe Doctrine that says, yeah, he's right, Europe, you do have to keep out of the Western Hemisphere, but on top of that, the United States is going to be the police power. We're going to be what's called the constable, right? The police power in the Western Hemisphere. And how do you think he's going to do that? It's going to come from that naval superiority that we just talked about. It's going to come from the Great White Fleet. It's going to come from military might on the part of Teddy Roosevelt. And that's why it's referred to as big stick diplomacy. Examples of where we see this used, Roosevelt's going to use it twice. Well, technically more than twice, but for our purposes here, the first I want to talk about is the Dominican Republic. I'm never, ever going to ask you formally about the Dominican Republic and how diplomacy was used there, but basically, the DR, the Dominican Republic, at this time is borrowing money from European nations for things. Unfortunately for the DR, they did not really have the ability to repay those loans. They didn't have the money to pay them back. So naturally, these European countries are going to come after the DR. They're going to say, hey, where's my money? Why haven't you paid us back? So in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, he's going to use his military might to basically sort of elbow his way in there and basically place U.S. naval ships on the coast, or off the coast rather, of the Dominican Republic. And if you're like, bro, I don't know where the Dominican Republic is, check that map up in the top right. I've got a big red circle around it. We're going to put American ships, and you can see how close it is to the United States. We're going to put ships there so that when Europe comes sniffing around for their money, we basically say, well, sorry, you're not getting in here. This is our territory. This is the Western Hemisphere. And basically, TR is going to use his military might to kind of strong-arm his way in there and make it so that the Dominican Republic has to repay the loans to America rather than Europe. And then we'll deal with Europe on the back end. But our top priority, Roosevelt's top priority, is he does not want Europe snooping around in the Western Hemisphere. Why? Why do you think that's so bad? Well, remember, we don't want more European colonies here. We don't want more European influence here. We want to be top dog in the Western Hemisphere. And for Roosevelt, he believes that the best way to do that is basically to keep everybody off of the Western Hemisphere and basically to let us kind of take the lead there. The other big example where Roosevelt uses this big stick diplomacy, you can see here on this globe, here's the whole Western Hemisphere, right? You got North America, Central America, and South America. That little red line, which I'm sure by now you know to be the Panama Canal, in 1904, the United States really, really wants to build this Panama Canal through that tiny little isthmus there that is Panama. Because if you can see on that globe, if you had a ship, let's say that there's a ship in Florida, or maybe a ship in South Carolina, or let's say it's right down the street, let's say it's in Baltimore, and we wanted to take a ship full of goods and send it to the other side of the United States, or maybe to Asia, or anywhere else in the Pacific, where would we have to go? We would have to go from Baltimore, we'd have to start here, and we'd have to sail all the way down all of this, all of Central and South America, come up, and then that way. And that's, number one, super, super, super time consuming. Number two, it's not very cost efficient. So Roosevelt uses the military to make this happen with Panama, because if you can see that red line there, naturally you're thinking, okay, it makes a lot of sense. If we could cut through there, that'd be really, really convenient. Long story short, Panama at this time is a colony, and it's a colony of Colombia. Not Colombia with a U, but Colombia with an O. You can see that here. Colombia, right? The nation of Colombia is the colonizer of Panama. So for us to say, hey, we want to build a canal through Panama, we had to go to Colombia. And we essentially offer Colombia $10 million plus $250,000 a year for every year that we're there. And that's a ton of money, especially in 1904. That's a ton of money. Colombia, though, they say, yeah, that's great, but we could probably get more money. No deal. You know, Colombia is a little greedy here. Maybe rightfully so. But Colombia doesn't really like that deal. So what we do is we turn right around and we go to Panama, and we basically whisper in the ear of Panama, hey, we know that you've tried to get your independence before. You know what would look really, really cool? If you had your own flag and not the Colombian flag. So we basically kind of light a fire under Panama and say, hey, why don't you go get your independence from Colombia? Because what we need to do is we need to recognize Panama as their own independent nation. Because if we try and just do this deal with Panama without getting the blessing of Colombia, that's going to be a problem. We're going to see a war declared. Nobody wants that. But what we do is Roosevelt takes his great white fleet and he basically sits it off the coast of Panama and says, hey, Panama, why don't you go ahead and try and get your independence now? And so Panama does. They say, hey, we want our independence. And Colombia says, yeah, sure, okay, whatever. And they send their military to Panama only to find the United States military, specifically the Great White Fleet, chilling right on the coast of Panama. And they're like, maybe this wasn't such a great idea. So maybe a little bit better of an example here coming from Panama with big stick diplomacy and Teddy Roosevelt.